I'm starting to think that Nintendo should initiate a massive expansion of retro studios. Now, I know this seems absolutely crazy. There are lots of things that are difficult about retro studios at the moment. Metroid Prime 4, personally, I really enjoyed, but had a lot of critics. And while many of those things were initiated in Japan by Kensuke Tanabe, there are also people who have criticisms about the structure of the game as developed by retro studios. Also, the studio has struggled to produce regular games over the years and had a lot of support to bring out even the games they did produce, such as Metroid Prime Remastered and Metroid Prime 4. All that said, I think there are good reasons to consider expanding it quite significantly. And I think we have to look first of all at the problem of cost, because that is something that Nintendo will consider. It is very expensive to have a studio like Retro because it's based in Austin. American wages are going to be bigger than Japanese wages anyway. Plus, they've got all sorts of other attendant costs with being based in America, premises, security, and whatever else. And of course, all of that is aggravated by issues to do with the currency, which means that it's more expensive to run an American studio. Something like Monolith Soft, Nintendo can run far more cheaply, and of course Monolith Soft do bring out regular Xenoblade games. Yes, the games don't sell enormously well, but they do sell well enough. Xenoblade 2 actually sold better than any of the Metroids as far as I know, and this is something that they can use to point to as a great example of them serving their Japanese audience and their hardcore RPG audience. And yet this is why I think the time has come for Nintendo to expand. I don't think they should be buying studios. I don't think that they have enough established relationships in the American developer community that they can just step in and snap some studios up. I mean, they may have. They had Shiver, and I don't think many people saw that coming. And obviously, they do have people they've worked with and people they trust. I do think there is a potential long term for people like Veland Studios and others to become part of Nintendo, but I don't think Nintendo want to go around hoovering up studios, and certainly not just because of some of the difficulties in the market at the moment after the changes at Xbox. But reading about id Studios, it's not just that they've lost a lot of stuff, and by the reports at Game Developer, it seems to be that they are losing 136 workers. Some of them were not permanent. Some of these also are people who are working in quality assurance, which, while important, I would assume is something that does come and go as people move between different projects and as projects reach their conclusion and move on. All that said, Nintendo does not want to be in the position of suddenly having an enormous new studio to manage and to sort of get into their own way of working. What they want to do is to hoover up the best talent and give them an opportunity to work on something really cool. And that's what they did in Japan with Monolith Soft. Tetsuya Takahashi and the crew were given the opportunity to create something with a level of freedom that simply could not be afforded at Bandai Namco. And for a long time, I thought it's unlikely that we'd see something like this in America because Nintendo just doesn't have the personal relationships over there to the same extent. Yes, I know they have Nintendo of America, but in any event, I don't think the top people there have quite the same very long depth of being at a senior position. Someone like Reggie Fils-Aimé, who had been at the top of Nintendo and had been very well recognized for a good 5 to 10 years, probably did have those kind of ongoing relationships. I'm not as sure that the current management, bearing in mind that the current CEO is primarily Japan-based as far as we know, and obviously Devon Pritchard is quite new to the role. I'm not entirely sure whether there is the same extent of relationships within the developer community, and I'm not necessarily sure whether there's the same extent of relationships with Asha Sharma, who after all didn't even come from gaming to start with. But at Retro Studios, they are in the Austin community. It strikes me that the Texas developer community is probably a relatively small world, and Nintendo has relied on them before, not just with Retro, but we've seen Panic Button, we have seen Iron Galaxy, although they seem to also have suffered quite a bit with layoffs lately, as far as I understand. And so it does seem like there is a hub there of people, and if Nintendo make themselves the magnet, then I think there's quite a lot of potential. And we know that when they hired Johnny Lundstedt, that was viewed by a lot of people as a real coup, as a real opportunity to do something new and different. Now, whether or not that quite worked out for Metroid Prime 4, I don't know. But I could certainly see more people coming to Nintendo and Nintendo building it up. Now, that does not mean that I would see the intention of this to be creating a Metroid Prime studio. Do not get me wrong, I love me some Metroid. I really would love Metroid Prime to continue. I would like to see Metroid Prime 2 remastered. I would like to see Metroid Prime 5. I would like to see loads of new Metroid. That is not in question. But I don't think that's the smart play here. I think the smart play is to get some of these really awesome people and say, look, you have experience of working on some of the top properties in the world, and now it turns out that all the work that id Software put in, all the reputation they've built for all this time is going to be ebbing away because they were bought out initially by ZeniMax, and now, of course, a lot of that stuff is being moved over to Bethesda. So Bethesda will be expanding to take on Doom, to take on Quake. Now, I'm sure that they could do a good job, and I'm sure as a franchise, as a property, as a name, it will continue to be reasonably well served. But I think if you are one of those people who feels a deep connection to the id name, to the id reputation, I think there is an opportunity to still do something great that is different, that is unique. And in Nintendo's case, all they really need to say is, tell us what you've got. We're going to give you the budget to do development work. We're not going to get in the way. We will expect games to be produced. But fundamentally, where Nintendo is right now, they do not need more safe bets. And that sounds odd because obviously safe bets sound great. But they've got Zelda. They've got Mario. They've got Splatoon, they've got Animal Crossing, they've got Pokemon. They have safe bet after safe bet after safe bet. They could play it safe for decades and be fine. What they don't have is a major Western property that gets attention and that completely shakes up the way that particularly American audiences look at Nintendo. And frankly, that has not been anywhere near a priority for them for a very long time, but it might be now. Now, I don't necessarily think that anything will even come of development work, because if you give very creative people the opportunity to explore, it might be that it comes to nothing. It might be that things end up getting recycled and moved on. But I think just giving the sense, putting up the signal in the sky that says, look, this is a place where you will have the kind of creative freedom, point to Monolith Soft and say, that's what they did. That's the kind of thing where I could believe that a lot of people would be pretty interested. It would be expensive. It would be risky. The potential payoff for Nintendo is huge. If you think about it, yes, it is more expensive to run American studios. But on the other hand, if they can shift significantly more consoles in America as a result, and if they can manage to create a new IP which really breaks out in an absolutely massive way, and they will have every piece of goodwill behind them, because if you're saying, well, a lot of the people behind Doom and Quake and Wolfenstein are now being given the opportunity to have creative freedom and to do something really awesome based at Retro Studios, which, let's face it, is a team with a considerable track record of awesomeness, well, you know what? I think a lot of people will be willing that game to succeed. I think they could have a very, very big launch. And I think most likely the quality will be there because, let's face it, Nintendo will work and make sure that the quality is there. It could be a very, very effective collaboration. It could be a source of a completely different kind of exclusive than anything that Nintendo has put out before. Now, where is the Metroid of it? I think that it is likely that if the studio expands, it is actually the best thing that could happen for Metroid Prime. If you bring in a whole host of new people, if you bring in, and they've already got a lot of Halo developers, but if they bring in a lot of first-person shooter experience and create a game, not a Metroid game, create a game that is a true first-person shooter experience, but of a completely different sort than anything we've seen before, and it generates a whole new buzz around first-person shooters at Nintendo, if they can build up an audience, then I think a lot of people might be a little bit more receptive to trying out the Metroid Prime games. And of course, there is an obvious pivot there to say, okay, well, that is more of a raw first-person shooter title. This one is more of an adventure first-person title. And then I think you could see the difference, and I think it would be a very logical progression to encourage people to get into Metroid Prime. I think they still do want people on Metroid Prime, and I think if Retro was significantly larger to the point where Metroid was something that they worked on between times, but it wasn't necessarily their bread and butter day to day, well, you know what? I actually think that will be the best case scenario for Metroid and Metroid Prime, because at the moment it cannot sustain Retro Studios. I just don't think it's going to be able to pull its weight, but I still think it has huge potential for Nintendo. I think Nintendo want it. I think they know the fans want it. I just think it needs to be a part of a broader pivot. Now, this is obviously not something that is necessarily going to be flagged up in a major way. I don't think you're going to see a press release saying that this is what's going to happen. But I think what we could see, and I think what we should see, is an aggressive pace of hiring specifically at Retro over the next year to 2 years. I think they'll be very careful about interviewing people, but I think they already have a number of people who have great experience, great reputations, and it shouldn't take that much longer for them to actually assemble a group that can start to be thinking about essentially a new Western AAA IP, probably in the first-person shooter space, that trades off the reputation of people in that community who have been working in that field for a very long time. I think there is a play here where Nintendo can do very well indeed. Now, I did do a video the other day which covered some of the general thoughts about the risks and advantages and opportunities of Nintendo looking at studio acquisitions or hiring individual people based on the changes at Microsoft, and so I'll refer you to that one. This is kind of extending beyond that, but I think the more I think about it, the more I think the real opportunity here, the specific opportunity, is at Retro, and I think it's particularly from those people at id who just now want something a little bit more secure, a little bit more free, a little bit more focused on creativeness, and also the time is now here where there is not that big a difference technologically between the Switch 2 and the other consoles. Yes, I know there is a difference, but by the time we get to whatever the new game would be, which potentially could be 5-10 years away, we'd be looking at probably new Nintendo technology anyway. And yes, it's nice to work with power, but also it's nice to create really awesome games, and I think that might be where the people who are minded to work with Nintendo effectively would happily find their feet. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.